Hey, what is going on guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS5 video. So we've seen the PS5 jailbreak get quite a bit more attention recently, thanks to the 60 FPS patches by Illusion and the lib hijacker by Ostrelski. We've even seen large media outlets like Digital Foundry covering this and shining more of a light on the topic. And since then, I've seen a lot of new people come into my comments section who are curious about PS5 jailbreaking and don't really know where to get started. So the idea behind this video is to just bring everybody up to speed on where we're at right now with the PS5 jailbreak, as well as cut through some of the confusion in relation to what firmware version you need to be on in order to jailbreak your PS5, especially since I am seeing quite a bit of kind of misinformation surrounding that as well. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that here in this video. So at the moment, we only have a partial jailbreak for the PS5 that is public on firmware 3.0 up to firmware 4.51. So any firmwares within that range, any system software versions within that range are compatible with this partial jailbreak. Now, the reason why we call it a partial jailbreak rather than a full jailbreak is because this is an exploit chain. It uses multiple exploits chained together, and that is a userland exploit and a kernel exploit. And that is enough to jailbreak the PS4, but on the PS5, we have additional security layers like a hypervisor, which restricts access to the kernel, which basically means we don't have full control over the PS5 yet because we don't have any kind of hypervisor exploit. So what that means is currently we're able to do things like load the debug settings on the console, which there's not a lot you can really do with that on its own. And it also runs a payload loader on the exploit, which means you can send an executable file over your network from another device like your computer, and it will execute that payload on the PS5 itself. And currently we have payloads for things like FTP, which will allow you to gain remote access to your PS5's hard drive and access the file system. And that's pretty much all we've really been able to do up until now. There's not really been a hell of a lot. And there's actually two different versions of this exploit implementation. There's a Blu-ray drive implementation that uses a modified Blu-ray disc to load the exploit. And there's also a WebKit implementation which uses the web browser to implement the exploit. That's the one most people use because they're basically the same exploit. They're just implemented in different ways. And generally the web browser is easier to access than, a Blu-ray writer. Now, what's changed recently over the past couple of weeks is we now have access to something called the lib hijacker by Ostrelski. And this essentially allows us to bypass some of the restrictions imposed by the hypervisor that we would normally require some kind of hypervisor exploit in order to be able to do. So for example, the way that it works is currently we have these payload loaders and they're restricted to the memory space of the application that they're running within. So for example, if it's loaded through the browser, you only have access to the memory of the browser, the WebKit. And if you're running through the Blu-ray drive, then you only have access to whatever memory space the Blu-ray disc or the Blu-ray drive has access to. So that's kind of the restriction that we've had at the moment, but this lib hijacker works differently where it runs a payload loader in the background outside of those two applications. So it can basically access more memory space of the PS5, including other foreign processes like game processes, for example, by hijacking the Redis server on the PS5 and using that to run a payload loader. So that's pretty much how it works at the moment, which means that we can now do things like patch game memory. So that allows us to do things like 60 FPS patches, developer menus, cheats, trainers, mod tools, remote debugging software. All of that stuff can be done now using this lib hijacker, and that's why you're starting to see these 60 FPS patches being ported over to the PS5 by Illusion. So that's essentially, where we're at the moment, and it's kind of turning this partial jailbreak into a full jailbreak. It's kind of getting there. The idea is that this will eventually be able to load homebrew applications, maybe even emulators, maybe even our decrypted game dumps could be run using this. So obviously it's still early days, but we're starting to see things come out now with the 60 FPS patches. So we're in this kind of transition period from this partial jailbreak to more of the functions that a full jailbreak would have. So that is pretty much where we're at the moment. So now let's dive into some of the firmware requirements because things get a little bit messy here. Normally for the PS4 jailbreak, we just say, here's the jailbreakable firmware, update to that firmware or stay on that firmware and you'll be good. You'll be able to access the jailbreak. It's a little bit more complicated with the PS5 though. So initially the firmware 4.03, that still gets mentioned a lot. There's still a lot of people mentioning firmware 4.03. I think even Digital Foundry was mentioning that it had to be 4.03, which isn't quite correct. So the reason why 4.03 gets mentioned quite frequently is because it's the equivalent firmware to 9.00 on the PS4, which is the latest jailbreakable firmware for the PS4. There's an exploit in the file system of the PS4 on that firmware version that you can use to basically jailbreak the PS4 using a USB drive. And the same vulnerability also exists in the PS5 on firmware 4.03. And of course, just like how that vulnerability was patched out of the PS4 in firmware 9.03, it was also patched out of the PS5 in its next update, which was 4.50. So that's why the general consensus before there was any kind of exploit on the PS5 was to stay on 4.03 or lower, because the vulnerability still exists in that firmware, so there's a chance it could be jailbroken in future, since the PS4 was successfully jailbroken using that same vulnerability. That was the general idea. However, that was kind of shot down by the Flow, who determined that it was impractical to try and implement that on the PS5 because of the extra security layers. But what did end up happening is the Flow discovered that there was an old bug in the PS4 for firmware 6.72, which was patched out in firmware 7.0 for the PS4, and that previous vulnerability was actually inadvertently reintroduced into the PS5 in firmware 3.0. So somebody at Sony made a huge mistake and ended up re-implementing a previously patched bug in the kernel, and that was essentially re-implemented in firmware 3.0 for the PS5, and was eventually patched out in firmware 5.0, as the Flow did report that to Sony through their bug bounty program, so it was patched out in 5.0. So that's why there's this window between firmware 3.0 all the way through to 4.51, all the firmwares in between. They're all vulnerable to this exploit, and that's the exploit we're currently using. That's this partial jailbreak that we're using at the moment in order to be able to do things like our 60 FPS patches. So that's pretty much where we're at there. So that's why we say 3.xx to 4.xx, because any firmwares within that range between 3 and 4.51 are all jailbreakable. And that's where things get even more complicated, because there's also kind of like a private exploit on firmware 2.50 or lower, because it's believed that there are people who have a hypervisor bypass, a hypervisor exploit for the PS5 on those older firmwares from 2.50 and lower, although we don't know at the moment if their exploit works on higher firmwares as well. So that's generally why we say not to update from, say, 2.50 to 3.0 or higher, so that you can use the partial jailbreak. It's better to stay on 2.50 or lower, because there's a chance that you could get a full jailbreak at some point in the future, since there's the hacking group Fail Overflow and the hacker Flats, who have successfully kind of fully exploited the PS5 on those older firmwares. Flats specifically stated that he was on firmware 2.50 when he did it, but he hasn't specified whether or not it will work on higher firmwares as well. So that's why we're kind of apprehensive to recommend people update from, say, 2.50 to 3.0 to 4.51 in order to access the partial jailbreak, when there's a chance that they could get a full jailbreak on the firmware that they're currently on, 2.50 or lower. However, Flats and Fail Overflow have not stated any intention to actually release any of this information. So it's kind of, you can kind of think of it as a private jailbreak on 2.50 and lower, and we don't know if it works on higher firmwares. And then we have this public partial jailbreak that we have from firmware 3.0 through to 4.51. And I guess I should also mention there's another little exploit called Mastercore, which essentially allows you to load PS2 apps on the PS5. It works up to firmware 6.50. The code has supposedly been updated to support the latest firmwares for the PS5, but you know, there's not been an official release for those higher firmwares. So right now, 6.50 is the latest firmware on the PS5 you can use this on, but you have to have a specific PS2 game bought from the store and downloaded and runnable on your PS5 in order to do it. So it's not really practical for a lot of people. And again, it can only be used to load PS2 apps. It can load other PS2 games, PS2 homebrew, as well as emulators designed to run on the PS2 as well. So if you want to run PS2 apps on your PS5, you can look into that, but it's far from a full jailbreak at the moment. So that's currently the state of things at the moment. There's kind of like a private jailbreak on 2.50 and lower, and we don't know if it works on higher firmwares. There's a public partial jailbreak from 3.0 to 4.51 that's kind of slowly turning into a full jailbreak with the extra functionality we're getting from the libhijacker, which is allowing us to run our 60 FPS patches and developer menus and other things. And then on top of that, there's also the Mastercore exploit, which can allow you to run some PS2 apps thanks to a bug in the PS2 emulator for the PS4 that can run on the PS5 through backwards compatibility, and that can allow you to run some PS2 apps. And that is essentially it. That's brought you all up to speed on where we're at right now with jailbreaking the PS5. So hope you guys found this information useful. If you did, please leave it a like and a subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.